Hello, I'm Evaleen from Awesome Training, and I'm here today talking to with Eoin Stephens, who is going to be presenting at Awesome Conference in 4 weeks' time on the 15th of November, and that will be an online event. So Eoin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conference. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's great to get an opportunity to have a chat with you. And I suppose to let people know who might be interested in the conference, a little bit more about you. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your own journey, kind of what led you to realizing you were autistic as an adult?
So, I realized that I'm autistic. It's just coming up to 8 years ago, and that was in my early 50s. It was the 4th of November, 2012. I got up that morning, and I'd been thinking a good bit about whether I was autistic, and it was all sort of coming together a bit. So I went to bed that night 100% sure that that's who I was, and it made complete sense. It had been kind of flicking around in my mind and bits moving around, and then it kind of all just came together, and I knew myself. It was quite an experience, actually. And I'm someone who'd been in plenty of therapy in my life as a therapist, and done plenty of self-exploration, but I knew there was something missing as well. I had this sense. I've explored myself a lot, and I'm a therapist myself, and I still haven't fully made sense to me. I knew that, and then this made full sense. It just kind of brought everything together. I suppose it also then raised the question for me, like, why did I not know that? Well, I think just, there just wasn't a lot of awareness around this. The explosion of awareness in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, gradually there's been an explosion around it. And I suppose so I was just more aware of it as a thing. I think we all thought of it as something rare and something very disordered and something that happens to other people and all of that. I was always somewhat nerdy and always, bookish and always a little different. And as I grew into adolescence and early adulthood, I was awkward and, intense and, lots of things which make lots of sense in retrospect. But I just saw those as things in themselves. I saw them as family characteristics. There's a lot of things that I would now say is autistic that I used to say that's a very Stephens thing, my father, my parents are passed away, but my father was definitely autistic in retrospect, and there's other, was even kind of questions around a family member in the 90s, as an adult. But, even in the 90s, professionals knew very little about this, and it was never kind of resolved, quite whether autism was relevant or not, But anyway, I was becoming more aware of it professionally, and a bit aware of it, sort of in possible traits in the family, and I just, as I said, began to think, but I'm a bit like that. I'm a very bit like that. I'm quite a bit like that. Actually, it'd be very interesting in a way if I was like that. Maybe it wouldn't be such a problem if I was like that. Oh my God, let's read everything about it.
Right.
And then it's just, hold on, this is just, mind-blowingly interesting, So for me, it was a very positive experience. And for most people in my life, now, not quite everybody, but for most people in my life, they were fine. That I told family and close friends, fine, interesting. Yeah. As long as you're happy about it, probably makes sense, So yeah, it was a very good experience for me. Very, very positive. The one thing I would say is that, and it ties in a little bit with other things we'll talk about in a moment now, my involvement in the therapy world. I suppose it's easy to have other explanations for why you're the way you are that distract from the fact that actually a chunk of stuff is explained by being autistic. And one part of that for me was, I said, well, that's just what my family's like. We're all a bit odd, But another one, of course, is the traditional explanations of the world of therapy. You have attachment problems, something must have gone wrong at that phase of your childhood. There's some trauma that you don't know about, there's some repression going on, So yeah, I tried everything, but and bits of things fit. I'm not saying they were wrong, but they never quite got the bit that this explained,
Yeah, and it is that a wonderful feeling when you where everything fits in and makes sense.
It's absolutely extraordinary, and continued obviously then for a long time after that, fitting. Oh my God, that makes sense too. And you know, gradually you start to notice the levels of masking, and you know how much you've twisted yourself out of shape as well, and
Yeah,
you know, begin to work on that, and yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah,
yeah. I suppose it's the start of a journey, isn't it? So,
yeah,
well, you'll
yeah.
be so 8 years nearly on the 4th of November. In fact, no, we should have scheduled it for the 4th of November. We can celebrate it. You know, you said something interesting there, I suppose, about kind of maybe how mental health professionals don't pick up on this. And actually, before I knew I was autistic, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago. Well, I'm
Mm.
trying to think when it was, but it was a good maybe 12 years ago, around that. You know, I suppose I'm a limited eater, let's say. I don't eat vegetables and things like that, and I kind of, you know, went through my, again, it's different phases of my life. I think I was just really conscious of this because I was probably like working and going out for dinner with people, and you know, just being really conscious of, you know, people finding it odd. And I was saying, I'll go to a psychologist and see what happens, you know. And like I went and I kind of explained, you know, my eating habits, and it was interesting that you said that there's, you know, she thought it was like something in my childhood that I missed out on a weaning stage, you know, when I in feeding, and kind of gave me some advice to try some foods that I just wasn't going to try. You know, but also the way she asked me questions as well, you know, she was like, are you happy? And of course, there's so much masking. I was like, yeah, sure, I'm happy out. You know, at the time I was in like an abusive relationship. I didn't, you know, she didn't kind of answer. You see, again, it was the way she phrased questions, just was so easy for me to just pretend and keep going. And
Play the game. Yeah.
play the game. That's it, you see. And I suppose it was an opportunity for someone to actually, you know, kind of maybe, you know, see what was going on for me. But it was missed because I suppose, again, like, first thing, if you hear someone is a picky eater, picky is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, it should be like sensory, you know, like literally.
Well, you know, it ties in with one of the points that I wanted to make, you know, because, you know, we said we'd talk a bit about the, you know, kind of what I see in my professional world.
Yeah,
And
that's, I suppose, the gaps in understanding maybe and the
yeah,
information that's
yeah.
out there.
And, you know, it just an interesting bit of my own history, kind of professionally and kind of intellectually, is for a long time, I've been very, very interested as a therapist and as a psychologist in areas like, you know, cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, you know, genetics and neurology, you know, kind of, you know, linguistics, anthropology, you know, all sorts of stuff that comes under what they call the heading of cognitive science, which isn't typical of a therapist, you know. And interestingly, an awful lot of that is the stuff that's been used to understand autism. You know, now not always understand it accurately. I'm not saying, you know, theory of mind is a very good theory, but it's an interesting theory, and it was a good stab at trying to understand what was going on for autistic people, you know. And it was strange that, as I said, I actually was already using the tools that are useful for understanding the autistic mind, you know, before I knew I was autistic myself, or even working much with autism. And one of the things that I think interesting about the autistic mind is that we don't accept information just because other people believe it, whereas most people like to fit in, and therapists like to fit in, and if everybody else thinks a certain way and that's the way they're taught to think, they don't want to be an outsider, you know. I tend to believe things on the basis of the evidence, and there has been overwhelming evidence for a number of decades now that most aspects of the human mind and human personality and human functioning are about as equally affected by genetics as they are by early experiences. And yet therapists love early experiences, and they are another huge part of what forms us. But so does genetics, so does genetics, so does genetics. That's what the science keeps showing. But, you know, therapists aren't interested ever since Freud, you know. You can't get off that bandwagon, you know. And so I think that's simply one of the things that made it easier for me to accept. You know, there's just a big genetic component into who I am. Great. Now I know, and this is what it's called. Makes perfect sense, you know.
Yeah, who you're meant to be. Yeah.
And, you know, the therapist I was working with at the time as a client was a very good therapist. And, you know, when I had this realization, you know, she didn't know much about it, but she was very supportive of it and open to being educated by me on it and so on. But you could see it was hard for her to grasp. It was hard for her to shift away from this is all attachment related stuff to actually a huge chunk of what makes you who you are is just your genetic neurodiversity, you know. So that's part of the answer to you know, the kind of gaps, I think, is that it's part of a bigger gap where people just don't take, you know, the genetic component of anxiety or introversion, you know, and sensory sensitivity even without autism, you know, all those things that are just part of the person in front of you. They're not a glitch that got in the system from some learning experience, you know. So that's a huge thing for me, and that's a life's work still ahead, I think, to try and shift some of that around. But anyway.
Yeah, well,
But other than that, there's
that.
some obvious answers as well to the gaps in the information. I mean, you had one of your summer webinars was around, you know, what is and isn't autism, two-parter. And you know, I mean, one of the key facts that comes out of that, obviously, that discussion is that an awful lot of mental health professionals are still operating on information that's 40 years out of date, you know, because they haven't updated since, you know, and the updating has been happening pretty quick for the rest of us, like even the last 5 years, you know, last 10 years. So, you know, kind of difference versus disorder, you know, people, you know, autistic people have no empathy, no emotions, you know, are cold, very little sense of the, you know, sort of minority stress phenomenon that we've talked a little bit about, and the complex post-traumatic stress that can not so much be some sort of cause of the problems, but is an effect of being autistic and treated badly, and, you know, people trying to make you be different than you are. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff I think that there still needs to be put out there. And, you know, I do offer training. It's one of the things I do, as well as being a therapist myself, a cognitive behavioral therapist, well, sort of integrative cognitive behavioral therapist, I suppose. I use other things, but I do training as well. And, you know, trying to get across this idea that of, you know, what I'm sort of calling autism informed therapy. You know, you've got to, if you're going to work with somebody who's autistic, then you've got to bring awareness to that, and it has to be accurate awareness, and you have to have some proper sense of what autistic neurodiversity is like, and you know, you've got to have some awareness of the language that's, you know, autism friendly, and you've got to be open to shaking off the myths, even if you haven't quite shaken them off yet. And, you know, in particular, therapy and mainstream therapy and neurotypical therapy and therapy training, it's not wrongly very relationship focused. You know, I'm not saying that's wrong. Like, it's the worst therapy that any of us experiences when the therapist isn't capable of forming a relationship with us, you know. So therapists should be relational, and they should be focused on relationship. But one of the things that's most different for autistic people from neurotypical people is the way we form relationships. Not that we don't form relationships. I was talking about this in my talk about transition to college for autistic people. You know, I had a very rough transition, school to college, but it wasn't because I'm not sociable. I'm very sociable, and I was even lucky enough to make some friends in first year of college, so I then dropped out. It was like it's the kind of more complex, you know, social nuances of kind of playing the game. You know, I couldn't play the university game, the academic game. I couldn't figure it out. And I think for a lot of autistic people, they don't necessarily know how to play the therapeutic game, you know, because everything is a social game, you know, everything is a subculture, you know. And so they don't necessarily know how to come in and do the niceties before you do the therapy, and then tell your story, which is what you're supposed to do, and then talk about feelings. Like we do it in our own way. And therapists, you know, much as, you know, they might claim to be person-centered, don't always, lots of therapists do a great job, but therapists don't always adjust to that. Instead, they think you should be fitting into this, or you're cold, or this, you know, you're resistant, rather than, oh, actually this person is very different and I need to actually change my expectations here. We're not going to have the same kind of nice chat that I have a lot with clients. This person is going to be very focused on content. They're going to want to know, what are we working on, you know, and they'll want to see what the results are, and they'll, they're ready to do the work. They're not going to do the fluffy stuff,
Yeah. And
you
some
know.
of us will.
Yeah, some of us will. Yeah, exactly. Or we will. But if somebody isn't interested, and that's my own experience as a therapist, as I say, autistic people aren't. We're all humans, so we're all different,
Exactly.
But some of my clients won't.
We're all different. So
This is it. But some of my clients, some of my autistic clients, aren't interested in that stuff. They just want to.
Well, there's a purpose, I suppose.
Tell me what the task is and how we do it,
Yeah.
and give me the information, and let's do it.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think, understandably, a lot of therapists aren't comfortable with that because it's not what they're trained for, it's not what they believe, and it's not what they went necessarily into the profession for. But with some autistic people, that's what they're going to get. They're going to get that's not
that's
how
a relationship. It's just a
not how
different
it's just different. It's not how I do relationships.
Yeah.
So that's one of the many things that I'm trying to discuss these days with therapists.
Yeah, and that's important, isn't it? Because, and I suppose it comes down to acceptance again, because if you just accept this person who's in front of you and whatever they do,
This
you
is
see
the,
right
the,
is
the bottom line. Bottom line, and it comes back to something we were talking about earlier, is that in one way neurodiversity means there are neurotypical people, and then there's neurodivergent people, or whatever language we might use. There's people who are autistic and people who are have ADHD and so on. But neurodiversity also just means every brain in front of us is different. Let's just go with that.
Yeah, it's quite simple, isn't it? And stop trying to make things very rigid so that everybody has to try and fit into it. It's
this is the way you're supposed to be. Yeah.
Well, it's like buying one outfit and expecting the whole world to fit into it. We are diverse.
That's it. That's it. Yeah,
we're
that's
all
a nice
different sizes. We're all
nice metaphor, all right. Yeah.
Into me there now.
Good. Very good.
Yeah, but that's it, isn't it? It's ridiculous when you think of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I suppose it's the history of psychiatry and all of that that you see that left all the women out of as well. We weren't there
that's another kind of fairly shocking piece, all right, when you look back in any of this. Yeah, I know.
But this is it, I mean, I think, and like that, so much of psychiatry and even attitudes towards disability were actually influenced by World War II and what was going on.
Right. That's right.
And people don't seem to think of this when they're looking at their, psychology books today and stuff. Yeah. It's where, this idea that there is one right way to be.
Yeah, I know.
And we're all horrified when we think of that and we read about the Holocaust, but yet it's okay when we're talking about psychology and different things. It's medical and it sounds fancy, and it's shocking. But
either way, just on the subject of men and women, and just my own work. As I say, I work as a therapist in private practice, and I work a lot with a variety of issues. I've worked a lot with addiction in my career. I work a lot with anxiety, particularly social anxiety, low self-esteem, work with a range of issues. And in a way, working with addiction led me to a lot of work with social anxiety, and working with social anxiety led me to a lot of work with autistic people. I began to realize some of my socially anxious clients, there was a deeper issue around how, the social world. But in the last, particularly about maybe very much the last 4 years, I've had a lot more work with people who are autistic in my practice, either realizing it because maybe their child is diagnosed, or for whatever reason, reading up on it, or it emerges in the work I do with them. So I have a number now of people, and I love that work. Working with social anxiety and low self-esteem and addictions and all sorts of other stuff, life issues, but taking into account a person being autistic or discovering that. My ratio of men to women is about 2 to 1, not like 4 to 1, 5, 10 to 1 or anything like that. It's about 2 to 1.
Okay, yeah. So
quite a lot of women that I work with who are autistic. Yeah. So
yeah,
I think the statistics are heading that way. I think it's probably 1 to 1, let's be honest.
Like every other population,
Yeah, exactly.
Probably 50-50.
Yeah, it's a very strange piece, a very strange part of the history, and a very strange part of even just the last 10 years, the massive, sudden kind of, oh my God, They're all around us.
It's like, wow, there's a big explosion. We're taking over. Women are autistic too. It's like, yes. And this whole idea that it's our fault. We've been masking too much. So that's why you didn't find it. Yeah, it's like, blame the women again. Oh, look at psychiatry and psychology. Blame the women, those sneaky women pretending. Yeah. And again, I accepted that story when I was told it first. Oh, yeah, women mask better. There's absolutely no research done on this to show that
No.
men and women mask differently or that women mask more. There's none. It was just a statement put out there to cover up, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
And I accepted that, probably for a few years until I, started thinking about all of this stuff and just saying, no, like, absolutely not. It's, again, it's, the diagnostics were based on boys' behavior. And this is the thing. It's like, so the people who wrote the diagnostics, saying that we don't have social skills, forgot that the world socializes boys and girls differently.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah,
I know. And this is the problem with the medical model. It's like it ignores its own evidence. It ignores like research in other areas.
Well, that's the thing, I think. Yeah.
Most of the diagnostics are, a traumatized autistic is what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Signs of anxiety, signs of trauma. So psychiatrists and psychologists who know this stuff, know about trauma, know about anxiety, didn't notice that these are signs of trauma in human beings.
I know.
Inability to, change, lives. What is it? Love for a routine. That's, very human things. And when human beings are stressed or anxious, they become more important. But these people didn't put that, and it's quite alarming, actually.
But I think it's, for me,
in charge of writing diagnostics, can't put these things together.
Well, for me, it's one of the things as an autistic person I now know that I most notice about neurotypical people. I always noticed it about other people, but I didn't realize that so much my autistic mind, and that is tribalism. The way that people kind of are in their little silos, within the world, their little ruts, where they think similarly, and they're not specially interested in views from other fields. That seems to be more typical human psychology. Never made any sense to me. I was never just interested in what the world of psychotherapy thought, for instance. I was always interested in what everybody else thought, anthropologists and psychiatrists and anybody who got anything interesting to say, But I'll tell you, I just give you a funny example, one of, just an odd example from the addiction world. I teach a lot on addiction, and I talk about the DSM criteria for substance abuse disorder and, gambling disorder and things like that. And, if you look at the lists of those two, what you find is things like tolerance and, overuse and attempts to stop that don't work and things like that. You see this overlap. And then in the list for gambling addiction, you see things like lying to protect the addiction and, sort of using the addiction to ease emotional pain and things like that. They're not mentioned at all in the substance use disorder list. It's like there's two committees in two rooms at different ends of a corridor. And because one is the group that works with gambling problems and the other is the group that works with substance disorder, they just never talk to each other. And like between DSM-4 and DSM-5, they never spoke to each other. And they never thought, oh, that kind of fits our list as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, substance addicts also lie. Why don't we throw that in?
Maybe addiction is just addiction.
Maybe addiction is just addiction. So, like, that kind of stuff is all over the place. It blows my mind because I just think, come on, folks, just.
I mean, I thought for a long time that addiction is, a symptom of something else. It's a sign, again, that someone is suffering. We're trying to escape, what's going on in our own lives. But yet it's kind of like, no, as if the addiction is this illness or disease. And that's kind of the narrative and another story that's kind of been told. And
yeah, well, that's another day's discussion, maybe.
Yeah, we better leave that now. So actually, one thing I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something very interesting during the summer when we did the webinar on social anxiety and masking. And you said that, like, being socially rejected. So we were talking about that's how autistic people are. We're kind of rejected by the world around us. By other people in it, but that manifests as like physical pain. I just wonder, would you just maybe kind of expand a little bit more on that for us? I thought so.
Well, it's interesting in a few ways. First of all, in a way, emotions are interesting things because they're kind of a mental phenomenon, but they're also very much a physical phenomenon. So they're sort of the thing that connects both mind and body in a way. And so, in a way, all emotions are experienced in the body at some level. And so we do feel anxiety, for instance, as a kind of a physical pain. And you know, first of all, therefore the feeling of social rejection, if you stop and look at it, is just felt in the body quite painfully. And you know, not only that, it's felt very strongly. So it's not just a mild pain. You know, it's something I touched into when I was again talking about transition from school to adult life. We landed in the end in our discussion at the end of the talk on the topic basically of loneliness, you know, and just how awful that is. I mean, I'd say the worst emotion I've experienced in my life, the hardest, was loneliness at big periods of my life, you know. So it's a topic we're going to come back to, I think, at some point. And you know, loneliness, social rejection, it's in many ways the hardest thing that can happen to human beings. There's some interesting evolutionary theory around this, the notion that, you know, as we evolved as hunter-gatherers, loneliness would have meant death. You know, you can't survive on your own. We can now survive on our own because we've got this structure around us. We can live in, you know, a little flat and never see someone day to day. Unfortunately, this is something that's been a bit ignored in current decisions. But anyway, the whole mental health side. But you know, but we can live. We can, you know, we can go out and do our shopping, and you know, we can watch the TV and you know, live. But you know, when we were evolving, you know, social rejection would probably have meant death. You know, as in, if you were ejected from the tribe, you probably just wouldn't be able to survive on your own. You know, you'd only survive as a tribe. And so, you know, we would have probably evolved to dread social rejection in some ways more than anything, you know. So it's a very powerful, you know, thing to explore in that way. But the specific piece of research that I was referring to, you know, there's an article on it, if anyone's interested, the American Psychological Association, so apa.org, they have an article from 2012 called The Pain of Social Rejection. So if anyone's interested, they can just Google it. And what they're talking about here is you know, neuroscience. They're talking about brain scans. And that's the interesting finding that I was referring to, is that, you know, they're talking about the way in which, you know, the way they quoted here is that, you know, that researchers have found surprising evidence that the pain of being excluded is not so different from the pain of physical injury. And they talk about it, how it can influence, social rejection can influence emotion, cognition, and even physical health. But specifically, what they did was some research where they, you know, deliberately had people being rejected, and you know, those who are rejected show increased activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate and the anterior insula. Doesn't mean anything to me, but sounds good. Two of the regions that show increased activity in response to physical pain. So as far as your brain is concerned, a broken heart is not so different from a broken arm. So in other words, the brain is very much interpreting it the same way as physical pain. It's treating this as highly dangerous, you know, avoid at all costs, and yeah, I think we can relate to that at some level anyway, you know.
Well, I think we've all had a broken heart, or we've all had a friend who doesn't want to be our friend anymore.
No, it's awful. It's awful. You know, it is literally one of the most awful things. And
it is. And I think it's important that we talk about these things, because this whole idea that autistic children and adults, you know, can't process their emotions. Instead of actually understanding what it is we're trying to process, imagine trying to process that social rejection and that pain on top of everything else. Never mind the fights and the noise. You know, it's having that physical pain of people, you knowing that people feel you're inferior, or that you're different, or not asking you to birthday parties, or, you know, all of that stuff that most of us experience. And it's just another example of how things aren't being put together.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the bits that's coming together in my mind. And I think, something I'm going to do now is just have a look at loneliness as a topic for autistic people growing up, and maybe try and put together some presentation on it, or a bit of writing. Yeah, because it's
I'd be very interested to see that, because actually when you feel lonely there, it's like, actually, we don't use that word. We talk about anxiety a lot.
We don't, you see. And I just have to say, I have felt anxious in my life, and I felt depressed in my life, and I felt frustrated, and I felt lots of things. But the worst things, the worst times have been when I felt really, really lonely. There was nothing worse. You know? That's the reality. And the loneliness was, as we know, loneliness isn't even about there not being people around. It's about not feeling connected to those people and feeling different and feeling people.
In a room full of people.
Oh yeah, totally. You know, yeah. But anyway, look, that's a piece to open up again someday.
I'd be looking forward to hearing more on that. That's an interesting. Again, we never put those things together. Loneliness isn't talked about enough.
But we don't, because there isn't any permission to. Like, you know, nobody ever validates it. You know, it's like, I mean, to be blunt, and this would probably bring me a bit into my own stuff on my own history around loneliness and so on. You know, I could start getting annoyed about it, you know, but like, frankly, nobody ever asked me if I was lonely when I was young. Do you know what I mean? That's the reality. And, you know, I think there were signs there even, you know, and still nobody ever asked me, are you lonely? And there's nothing we can do about it, you know? So.
Yeah. Oh, I said, I'm going to finish this in a minute. And I'll be like, oh, no, Owen's done it again. Said something. Like when you talk about social anxiety, I was like, oh, that's it.
But you do that to me as well. But anyway, that's what we're there for. Yeah.
It's good to think about these things. But yes. So. Okay. Actually, I had an interesting question. I did I was doing my Get Connected social skills course live for the last 2 nights, and I had a mom who asked a very interesting question. I just kind of thought I'd ask your opinion on it. So her boy is 12, very empathetic child, as most of us are. But he would have specific difficulty around, like, say, the subject of biology. Now, he loves and is very good at physics and chemistry and would hope to do that in secondary school, but obviously the science subject has biology in it for the first 3 years of the cycle. So, you know, he might feel sick, he might faint, you know, if he's reading certain things about, you know, or there's no way he could dissect anything in a lab, any of those kind of things. So she knows that he would have difficulty around that. So she was wondering, you know, whether some sort of therapy would help him. And I just would like, I suppose, your input on it, which would probably be similar to what I thought, but yeah.
And, you know, I think it's another piece actually that I must put on my list of stuff to talk more to therapists about. Because I found in my own practice and my own experiences that, you know, a bit too much is ascribed to anxiety and phobia, and a lot of stuff actually should be ascribed. So a lot of it is about anxiety and phobia and learned, you know, anxieties, but a lot of those reactions are just about high sensitivity. There's some, you know, work being written over the last, whenever, the 80s, 90s, I can't remember when, the highly sensitive person, I can't remember the name of the author. I think quite a lot of that is about autistic people. Yes. Not necessarily all of it, but you know, high sensitivity, whether it's sensory or whether it's more emotional, empathic, is an issue in itself, as we know, as we're learning, you know, and particularly for a lot of autistic people, they're sensitive souls, you know, in various ways, and they feel the world very deeply. You know, that's one of the things I remember that I could never explain to myself. I would find, for instance, the beauty of nature overwhelming. You know, it was too much for me, you know, and I thought, what the hell is wrong with me? We're in this beautiful place and it's too much for me. There must be something very disordered with me, you know. But, you know, so we have that in different forms, I think. And I think it is important not to then automatically treat it as anxiety or a phobia and try and cure somebody of it. And that'll be the danger, I think, for that young lad. On the other hand, to live in the world, we do sometimes have to toughen up a bit around our sensitivities, you know. Yeah. But I think it should be our choice. Other than that, we should have the choice to avoid certain areas if we're not comfortable with them. You know, everybody doesn't have to study the same things or be comfortable with everything, you know. And I wouldn't be great with the likes of things like blood. I cannot watch medical dramas, you know. So I'd be a bit similar myself. And I just don't, you know. But you know, some level of graded exposure, as we use with phobias, can be of some value with sensitivity. You know, in the end of it all, if we're the type who doesn't like the cold, but we end up living in Canada, we'll get used to it, you know, a bit more anyway, you know. So we can do a bit of work around our sensitivities. But I think the 3 points I would make is only a bit. Don't expect people to change a lot. Don't treat it as anxiety and phobia if it isn't. And by and large, where possible, people should have the choice to just say, I'm not comfortable with that. Is it essential? If not, could I be absolved?
What we were saying, and then some of the other teachers were saying, was kind of like, maybe talk to the school and see, if within the rigid system, if possibly, there could be a way around this, because to me that would be the solution, rather than trying to make him be able to cope with.
Yeah. I mean, in the end of it all, it's partly a question of whether it's going to affect somebody's life or not,
Yeah.
I mean, I have a bit of claustrophobia, but only in very confined spaces, not in elevators or whatever. And I don't have to be in caves and places like that. That's where I discovered it, So therefore,
conference in a cave, Owen.
Yeah, well, it could yet happen if civilization collapses. But anyway, yeah, I just, I don't go into caves, and other than that, I get out of my life, if we're on holidays and
that's avoidance being a very good coping mechanism. And yet, if a child decides to avoid something, it's like, no, they can't avoid it. We must teach them to do it.
Yeah. So if we go on holidays, everyone else can go into the cave, and I'll go and get a coffee, and that's all. It doesn't. No great loss, do you know what I mean? So, once the leaving cert is over, that youngster might never study biology, if they want to be a doctor, it's a different issue, but probably don't.
Again, it was just because he loves physics and chemistry, and you see, they are coming together.
And yeah, if you're studying science, you need to study the other sciences, I know.
For a few years, whereas I think after fourth year, he could go on and then specialize in So, okay, that's good. Thank you for your input on that. It was just an interesting question, I thought.
It is. Yeah.
Tell me on, because I met you at our conference last year in Cork. I just wanted to know, I suppose, well, first of all, like, what brought you to the conference? How did it come up on your radar? And then also, I suppose, kind of what effects, or how did it did it have any change on your thinking, maybe, or kind of what you came away with?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was a great experience, and I tell a lot of people about it. I was simply looking for, not only information, and I was educating myself rapidly, but I was looking for information in Ireland, Ireland relevant, and also people. I do like people, despite being autistic. I know, shocking, but
me too.
Some people, actually not that many people, but anyway, but some people. Yeah, so that was what was exciting for me, was just that this was something happening in Ireland with Irish, mostly Irish people, organised, Irish people. I was very interested, and I know, not all the speakers were from Ireland, but I was also very interested in the, the fact that speakers were autistic. That was very exciting, and I thought, wow, fair play. Just, this is really interesting. Great idea. Great step forward. And well, it was very interesting. Like the range of speakers was fascinating. But what was most had the most impact on me was just meeting lots of people. And I suppose this year it'll be online, and as we've discovered, online is a good substitute, and it does enable people from further away to attend and so on. But still, there is something very exciting about being in a room full of, not everybody there was autistic, but just large numbers of people who are autistic, and this sense of, I already felt there's lots of people out there, and I'd made lots of connections online, and that, but to just think, there's lots of other people, real people, they actually exist, here they are, making noise, it was very interesting. And the way that then a conference like that makes allowances for people being autistic, I loved the green, orange and red stickers, for don't talk to me, or feel free to talk to me, or ask me, like that kind of thing is exactly what's needed. It's just the society adjusting a little bit in fairly simple ways to difference, so yeah, it was meeting people, that was the real thing that sticks in my mind, just that room.
For a lot of people, I mean, it was just, but it was kind of like we all experienced the sense of community for a day, and there was non-autistic people there, there was a lot of autistic people there. but non-autistic people commented on just how lovely the atmosphere was and how accepting and how comfortable they felt. And this is the thing, if we change things, it was all small changes, like paying attention to lighting and different things like that.
And clapping, yeah.
Yeah, you know, with that, they felt more comfortable. And it was like, this is what we could be, this is the way the world could be. You know, like, what are we doing? Why are we messing this up for ourselves? We could just have this lovely experience all of the time. Instead of like putting people into sections, we could all just like, you know, make the changes for the more sensitive people or whatever and include everybody, and we'd all have a better time. I think judging on some of the feedback we got from our webinars and stuff over the summer, I think we have been able to translate some of that kind of atmosphere online.
Definitely.
I know it's not the same, but I think people find it that it's relaxed, that it's fun, you know, that it's not kind of this serious thing where all kind of lecturing people on.
Exactly. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think so. You know, and you know, people have got used to being online, so I think generally people have learned to just, you know, be a bit more relaxed and enjoy the experience and
it's good for people to see autistic people interacting. You know, we could be talking about our social skills and the way we communicate all we want, but if you just witness two people talking, it's like, oh look, it's fine.
Plenty going on.
You know,
so I'm looking forward to that now. I think it'll be great again, just to get the conversations going. I mean, it was fascinating, because it is fascinating, and people have such interesting things to say from so many angles, you know.
This is it. It's from different angles, isn't it? And different people and different topics and everything. And it is about starting a conversation and people kind of, you know, getting to know more, I suppose, about autistic people and about more about our community and about the children, you know, how, you know, I suppose, you know, we can change lives for the children in our community. It's all about positive. This is the thing. It's about positive change. There will not be any negative narrative around the way we exist, because I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
That's an interesting point as well. You know, because if I look back on the last 8 years, you know, from my realization, you know, one of the things I've seen, and, you know, I've read about it as well in other people, one of the things I've seen was, you know, the kind of, the extent to which I was bought into the myths because I didn't have other information, you know, and the extent to which I had, you know, a certain amount of internalized ableism, you know, a certain amount of, you know, when I first realized I was autistic, was almost like, well, you know, that's a glitch, but at least I know what it is and I like it. But it is a disorder. You'd be better off in a way if you weren't, you know. But I don't care because I like being different. You know what I mean? But still, it was like a second best version of a human. You know, there was still some of that somewhere. You know, and it took me a while to shake off some of that, really. You know, and I think something like the conference really helps that. It shakes a lot of that out of you. It's just like, that's just so nonsense.
I mean, I would have too. I mean, I would have said I was an Aspie, you know. I didn't, and I'll be honest, you know, the word autistic stuck in my throat.
Same here. I
wasn't saying it.
No,
you know, and it took me, and it was again when I kind of realized, wait a minute, what they're saying about us isn't true. You know, my own pride and my own identity, I think, grew there. You know, so I understand people who kind of maybe, you know, aren't able to identify as autistic or whatever, because there's a lot to it. You know, there's a lot of accepting ourselves, I think, as we are, and maybe not accepting that kind of medical idea of us. But, so tell me, Eoin, what kind of things can we look forward to hearing more about from you? Your presentation is called, I love the name of it, it's called Double Vision.
Well, you know, I'm you know, somebody who has a lot of my experience about being autistic is personal, but also a lot of it is professional. So I have a real mix, you know, and a funny sense of, you know, kind of being in a way caught in the middle, you know, which is an old feeling, being autistic anyway, you know, not quite fitting in anywhere, sort of. So, you know, it's not a if you like, big problem for me, but it's just interesting to see it from both sides. And the reason I want to talk about it is because I think that there are some difficult issues around this kind of, you know, the professional views, the experts, the therapists, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, and the experiences of people who are autistic. You know, there's a very checkered history, obviously, and you know, experts, you know, haven't necessarily, you know, covered themselves in glory, and you know, professionals and currently. we can have difficult experiences with professionals, and I had at least one difficult experience with a mental health professional myself, about a year or so after I had my realization, after I discovered. But I want to just tease that issue out a bit, where we are now in the field. And, basically I will be saying, look, let's mix the best of both. It's basically what I'm saying. That's the double vision. I think it is, let's reject what we need to reject that professions are saying and educate them, as much as we can. But let's also, accept that if there are things that scientists can tell us that we can't tell ourselves, we can't look at our own brains, and things that therapists can offer if they're willing to also accept the differences in the person in front of them. And in particular, I'm just going to use a little bit of my experience from the world of addiction counselling just as a parallel. There's differences because obviously addiction is a problem or a disorder that you need to, in a sense, recover from. But it's also an identity as a recovering addict that people wear with pride, and huge amounts of the influence on the field has actually come from people's own experience, which is great. It's not all about experts, and yet huge amounts of what we do in the addiction counselling field also comes from experts, psychologists, professional scientists, researchers, and yeah, there's a bit of a checkered history there as well, but it's a kind of a working together, So I just thought it would be an interesting thing to open up for people.
Brilliant. I think it's hugely important. I think there's so many autistic adults walking into psychotherapists, psychologists, counselors, offices probably every day, and maybe again, people not knowing enough about it and missing opportunities to genuinely help someone and reach out to them maybe. And I suppose I was lucky. I had an amazing counsellor before I knew I was autistic, but again, she just accepted me. We just had a great relationship, and when I was diagnosed, I went back to her for a bit of support, and we just, again, because it came down to acceptance. She kind of got me. I didn't know I lost at the time, but I remember kind of thinking, I must be honest with this person. It's that kind of like, what, I'm going to this person, but I didn't. It's not that I was lying to everybody else, and again, I didn't. And I was masking, but in my head I was like, well, I'm gonna have to tell them the stuff that goes on in my head and my heart. But
I can relate to that. Yeah. Like, what would people think if I told them what I really think?
Yeah, that's it. But I think mental health professionals have such an opportunity to change our lives and to make our lives better. And it is just educating and upskilling and knowing a bit more.
Yeah. So if we can get good dialogue going, I think in both directions, then it's in everybody's interest,
We have to start talking about things in Ireland. Oh no!
Oh my God, I know, and listening.
Listening as well. Oh my goodness!
My God.
Yeah, well, we'll start it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation on the 15th. And Eoin, just maybe if anybody's watching this and they might like to see you as a professional, or they might be interested in your training, how would people find you? What's the best?
Well, I have a website, and it's just eoinstephens.com. So EoinStephens. So anybody wants to track me down, just go there. It's the simplest thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Brilliant. Okay, that's fantastic.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for
joining
me today, and we'll talk to you again in a few weeks'
time.
time.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. We'll talk soon. Yeah, looking forward to the conference now. Not far away. See ya.
4 weeks. Bye.